Okay, so this session is Neural Networks, WTF, and our speaker today is Katharine Beaumont. Sponsoring this vJUG session is Zero Turnaround, and the participating JUG is the Bucharest JUG. Unfortunately, we had some trouble on the actual day, so this is actually going to be a recording, a replay of Katharine's session, which she kindly prepared for us after vJUG24. So I mentioned Zero Turnaround are the sponsor for this session, and one of the products which Zero Turnaround have recently released as a 1.0 is XRebel Hub, which is the only APM for development and test. So it's an APM which is designed for the development and test phases. As a result, you can integrate it with perhaps your CI environment and test for regressions while you're building your application and testing your application with integration tests, rather than delaying till later in your production or late staging environment with much more complex scenarios. So one thing that XRebel Hub does provide is the ability to test your applications from a performance point of view as early as possible. So without further ado, over to Katharine.
Hi everyone, welcome to this session. Huge thank you to vJUG24 and thank you very much to sponsors Zero Turnaround for this. Thank you also to Bucharest JUG for watching this. This is the recorded version, but I really appreciate you sticking with me during the live one where I had a few issues. So before I start, I want to apologise. I'm going to pronounce a few names wrong, not through lack of trying, I'm afraid, just through general incompetence. If you have any difficulty in understanding me, please direct message me on Twitter for the transcript of this. I will put it up on my blog eventually, but if you want the kind of rough version, please send me a message and I'll send it to you straight away. Okay, so first of all, what is a neuron? Neurons have been thought to be the fundamental units of the brain and the nervous system. They're responsible for receiving and processing input from the world, sending commands to muscles, and they work in a highly parallel way. So we have about 86 billion of them. You'll see the figure 100 billion a lot, but this is disputed in 2012 by Dr. Susanna Herculana Huzel. She melted 4 brains into brain soup, and she counted. She counted a sample and then scaled up, I should say, not 100 billion total. So 100 billion is a number that goes around on the internet quite a lot, and she wanted to verify it. 86 versus 100 billion is quite a large discrepancy. A baboon brain has 14 billion neurons, so we're missing a whole baboon brain. Anyway, we have a lot. Signal outputs from a neuron can excite or inhibit other neurons. If a certain threshold is exceeded, a neuron fires. The more a neuron is excited, the more often it fires. And it fires in the sense that an electric pulse travels down the axon until it reaches the synapses. Now, the synapses release neurotransmitters. These transmitter chemicals diffuse across space to the target neuron. They bind to receptor molecules in the dendrites of the target neuron. I'm telling you all of this because when we get to artificial neurons, it will become obvious what we're trying to do. But crucially, in this model, synapses adapt. They can vary the number of vesicles of transmitter, so how much they fire, or the number of receptor molecules, so how much they receive. Neurons work together and the brain is modular, so different parts do different things. Also, studies suggest it's flexible. It can relocate functions. So, loosely and theoretically speaking, if you lose part of the brain related to hearing, you might be able to recover this ability in another part of the brain. So we have these biological neurons, these fundamental units of our brain, and they work in networks in a modular brain, and the connections between the neurons can adapt. But should it be considered to be the smallest unit? The Neuron Doctrine is this idea that the neuron is the smallest unit in the brain that we need to focus on in order to understand how it works. So this came about, it can be traced back to 1906 when the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology was awarded to 2 men, and they couldn't stand each other. It was Ramon E. Cajal and Camillo Gogli. So Gogli came up with a staining technique that they could use to see structure of neurons in the outer cortex using silver nitrate. Cajal's view was that the correct level to look at the nervous system, if we want to understand it, is the individual neuron. And that's what's known as the Neuron Doctrine. However, there is opposition to this now, but it has been widely accepted for the last 100 years. So, in the meantime, after the Neuron Doctrine, while it's this prevailing theory, Wallen McCulloch and Walter Pitts came up with a model of the neuron that informs many of our theories about the brain. The idea is more appropriately attributed to McCulloch, and he's considered one of the founders of AI. So, just as a side note, he was a deeply religious man, and he was actually more concerned with phenomenology. So, he took the functioning of a nerve cell and these spikes that are emitted. So, remember when a neuron gets excited, the more excited it is, the more spikes it emits, the more it fires. Anyway, he noticed one property, which is that the spike is either there or not. There's no halfway. So it's either on or off. So McCulloch and Pitts made a direct link from this property of neurons to logic. So this is the idea that nervous systems can implement logical functions. And this led to the threshold neuron, which we'll come to later. And it's an artificial neuron for computations. But the problem is, how do we get these neurons to learn? How do they all connect up? So early work by Frank Rosenblatt on perceptron has got everyone really excited, particularly in terms of how they learn. So the perceptron model, take a look at it. It's very interesting. It's interesting because if there is a way to converge, then it will, but that's something for later. But these perceptrons formed the smallest units of artificial neural networks, these multi-layer perceptron networks. However, there were limitations to them in terms of how they learn, and in 1969, Minsky and Papert proved their limitations. So it was pretty devastating at the time for perceptrons, and a few people cite that paper on perceptrons, the book on perceptrons and their limitations, to be one of the reasons why research dwindled a bit after that. So we still have this how do artificial neural networks learn problem. Now, in 1986, although it was invented earlier, a paper on this invention, called backpropagation, was written by Geoffrey Hinton and all. And we'll cover this topic later, but it's really important because backpropagation is a learning algorithm for neural networks. So this answers the question, okay, so we have these little individual artificial neurons, how do we get them to learn? And suddenly it became feasible, although very, very computationally expensive to train large networks. So suddenly we've got a good way to get these artificial neural networks to learn. And then with greater computational capacities, suddenly we've got an explosion of interest in neural networks. But in the meantime, should we be looking at individual neurons? So remember, this all comes back from a theory in 1906 that we should be looking at individual neurons, not groups of them, or not anything else to understand the brain. So it's just interesting to know your history in that, and also to note that not everyone's excited about this, not everyone buys into it anymore, and I'm sure any neuroscientists or cognitive scientists watching this will wave their hands and dispute this. But in the meantime, the doctrine took off, and why is everyone excited about it? So I'm simplifying, but with neural networks, there are two main branches of research. First of all, using artificial neural networks to better understand the brain. So if you take anything away from this, please watch this TED Talk with Henry Macram from the University of Lausanne. He leads the Blue Brain Project, and it's really interesting trying to understand the brain using artificial neural networks as a tool. But the other branch of research is building a style of parallel computation inspired by a particular understanding of the brain, which we know now comes from this Neuron Doctrine. So we're going to look more at this. And what are we trying to get? We're trying to get a computer to learn how to learn. Specifically, things that are typically easy for us to do, but difficult for a computer. Like, how easy is it to look at this and answer this quickly? Not so easy. And then, what animal is this? Much easier. Unless you've never come across a rabbit before, of course. So what we're looking for are programs that can do things like image recognition, speech recognition, all of these things that we find easy and immediate. So we've looked at biological neurons and we've got a bit of history behind us. We know McCulloch made a link between biological neurons and logic. So we're going to look at what that means and some of these artificial neurons that I mentioned before we piece them together in a network. And just a kind of warning, from now on, I'm switching terminology. So when I say neuron, I mean artificial neuron, not biological. Okay, so linear neurons. A linear neuron takes a real valued input and it maps it to a linear output. So you might have some input data, x, and times it by a weight, this w here. You might also see that as the Greek letter theta, but I'm just going to try and keep it simple with w's. And then some kind of bias term, this b, and then we're going to get this output. So let's add some numbers in, like 2. 2 for the weight, the w, and 2 for the bias, the b. So this is a linear function. And the bias is like the y-intercept. In fact, it is the y-intercept. It shifts the output function. Or we could look at it in a neuron-y kind of way. We could have 2 inputs, the x and the b here, feeding into this other neuron. So you can imagine that the x is an input neuron, the b is an input neuron, the w is a weight along the synaptic line, and then we've got this neuron here which contains the sum of them. Or we could look at this picture. We could imagine you go to the fish and chip shop because you're hungry, and you buy some portions of fish and some portions of chips, and you get this price in dollars for them. But you don't know how much the fish cost and how much the chips cost. So these input lines, you can imagine them being the axons and then connecting at the synapses to the dollar neuron there. And we're trying to learn the weights on the line, or how much the fish contributes to the price and how much the chips contribute to the price. When you have more and more inputs, it doesn't get more complicated, it just gets a bit more cumbersome. So because we want the sum of all the inputs times these weights, we can write it in a few different ways. Let's take a look. So that big E-like thing there means sum of. So we're going from the sum of 0 to some number n. So if we've got, go back a bit, if we've got 3 inputs there, it'll be the sum between 0 and 2, forwards, of all of the x's and all of those weights. And again, I've used the little Greek letter theta there as well as the w, just to show you that when you come across it in literature, it might be written in different ways. Sometimes the bias is included in this sum, and you might just call the x value for that 1, and the weight is the bias term, or sometimes you might see it separately. So let's just come back to this idea of the weights, that w on the line. So the weights act like synapses controlling what leaves one neuron and enters another. So with a large weight, you have a bigger input, and with a small weight, you have a smaller input. What we're building up to is a way to get the right weights. But for now, just remember that they control the outputs and inputs. So we're getting a linear output for some real valued input. When using linear neurons, you might come across this term activation function, specifically the identity activation function. This will become more obvious when we look at the next type of neuron, and I'll refer back to it. But in the meantime, here's something for you to try. So go to the TensorFlow playground and select this first data set here. You can see on this slide the data set with the orange dots and the blue dots in the middle, forming 2 circles. If you make the activation linear, can you separate the data? This is what your answer should look like. So binary threshold neurons. These are the McCulloch and Pitts neurons. So this idea of, we've got this idea of the synapses, which is the weights, and now we want this idea of the neuron firing, and this is going to be the activation function. So let's take a look at our neuron again. Here we've got all of our inputs coming in. We want to do something to the sum of them to activate them. So let's take a look at the binary threshold neuron. Here what we're doing is we're taking the sum of all the inputs, the x1 times w1, x2 times w2, x3 times w3, all added together. If they're greater than some threshold, which I've just put down as t there, then we're going to send out a 1. Otherwise, we're going to send out a 0. So it's either on or off. This is the McCulloch and Pitts neuron. So if the input is over some configured threshold, we fire 1, otherwise 0. And that's our concept of activating it. The limitations is similar to linear neurons. So if you feel like writing something up yourself, take a look, see if you can solve the XOR problem with binary threshold neurons. That's a problem that isn't linearly separable, so I'd be very surprised if you do solve it without adding an extra dimension, but have a go. Okay, so logistic neurons, we're going to look at this concept of activating it again. And here what we do is we take the sum of all the inputs, and then we put it through this function here, which is the sigmoid function. Don't worry if you don't understand the maths. The important thing to remember is that just like the binary threshold neuron, where we take the inputs and we either output a 1 or a 0, here we take all the inputs and we output some real number between 0 and 1. And that number doesn't fall in a linear range, it falls in this range here, it looks like an S. And this is important because now we can map functions that aren't linearly separable. Okay, so let's take a look. Go back to TensorFlow and try that first dataset again, but make the activation sigmoid. See now if you can separate the data. So there are some other activation functions that also aren't linear, like the rectify linear neurons and tanh, but don't worry so much about them, just be aware of them and have a go on TensorFlow and see what you get. But the theory is similar to the sigmoid neuron in that you're mapping some input to a specific output range. So at this point you might be thinking, how do we go from these neurons with their activation functions and their weights to the networks? And how do you go from mapping inputs to outputs, these glorified function machines, to separating cats from dogs? We're going to put these neurons together in a network. We can call them networks because they're essentially composing together lots of different functions. So first of all, we've got the bias terms. Here I've just put them as ones to make it really obvious. And we have a set of training data. So you see that input layer there. Each one of those inputs, the x1, x2, and more, might correspond to, for example, every pixel in a grayscale image, and the value would be that percentage, the percentage of grayscale that it is for each individual pixel. So you could have thousands of input neurons. Or if you're looking at, say, house prices, each input might be a feature. So you might have the size of the house in square feet as one input. You might have the number of bedrooms as another input. You might have whether or not there's a garage as another input. And you'll have a set of data. So maybe you've got 100 different examples of houses or 1,000 images. For every single example in this set of training data, we feed it through the network. So we put the data in the input layer, and then we multiply the input layer by these weights that connect them up to the next neurons. So you can see that x1, that's going to be times by a weight as it goes to the first unit of the hidden layer, and a weight as it goes to the second unit of the hidden layer. And then they're going to be added up. And if you go back in the video to look at the individual neuron, they're all just feeding into the neurons at different points, and they all have a weight per line, so they have a weight per synapse. So then in the hidden layer, we add all of these together, apart from the bias term, just ignore that for now, the one at the top. And we activate it depending on what type of neuron it is. This is called the hidden layer because we're not specifically telling it what to do. This might not make a lot of sense now, but if you ever look at really large networks, so deep networks, where you've got multiple hidden layers, it becomes more clear why it's hidden, because you could think of it as it just gets so confusing, there are just so many of them. But really, we're just not specifically telling it what to do, we're just feeding things through. What we're really doing is we're specifying the input and the output function. So we then times the outputs from these hidden units by the weights that connect it to this output unit here. And eventually we get the hypothesis. So the hypothesis is, what has the network predicted? The output might be one unit or several. So we might be looking in the house prices for one output unit because we want the real value of the house, we want the price. And that would be a regression problem. If we're looking for, say, I don't know, what image is this? Is this an image of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9? Is this a digit? Then we'd be looking at several different output units. And that would be a classification problem because we're trying to say it's of this class, class digit 1, or this class, class digit 2. Or we might be looking at a probability distribution across several outputs. So like, this is 60% a cat, 20% certain it's a dog, and 20% certain it's a lamppost. And that's a classification problem there. The crucial thing is that once we have the hypothesis, we've got this value for every training example of what the network thinks it is. Then we can compare it with what the training example actually is. This gives us a concept of how much the network is correct, but we tend to talk about it in neural network terminology as how wrong the network is, what the cost is, or what the error is. So what's the cost of it being wrong? Is it wrong by a little bit, or is it wrong by a lot? Once we have this cost, we compare each of the weights with the cost function. Because what we really want to do is we want to find out what these weights should be to get the right output. So there's an algorithm called gradient descent, and this is part of the backpropagation that we mentioned in the history session with Geoffrey Hinton. We're going to look at how the cost function changes with the weights. So can we get a set of weights where the cost function is low? So we can see this example here, we just have one weight. So it's really easy, we know that we should be getting for that bottom of the blue bowl there. Whatever that value for the weight is, the cost is as low as possible, so that's good. However, if we take a look here and count up the number of weights, we've got 9 weights there. So we need to compare each of those 9 different weights with the cost function. And suddenly it's not quite so easy because in 1 dimension it's awesome. And in 9 dimensions it gets very complicated. And this is a simple network. Imagine if you have 1,000 input units. So it's like trying to get to the bottom of a valley in multiple dimensions. And it does get pretty tricky. But before you get put off, it's been done before. So you don't need to implement it. Now, I want to tell you about the learning rate. So just imagine we're doing this analysis of the weights and the cost function, and we're trying to move in a direction where we get the lowest possible cost for every example. So we're trying to change the weights a little bit each time so that they change the cost function and they make it lower. And the learning rate is basically like the step size. So what we're trying to do is walk down a hill, for example, to get to the lowest point. And if you're a giant, you might completely overstep the bottom of the valley and jump over to the next hill. And if you're tiny and you're taking tiny steps, then it will take you forever to get to the bottom of the valley. So that's kind of what the learning rate is doing. It's how fast you're going to get there because it's the size of the steps. But if your step size, if your learning rate is too high, you can completely miss the lowest point. And if it's too low, it will take a very long time. So underfitting is what happens when your network doesn't give a good description of the data. You might get a really high cost function, so a really high error. So it's too general and it's not really giving you anything. There are a few reasons why this might happen. First, the network's too simple for the relationship you're trying to work out. Or if you're using an activation function that can't describe the relationship for you, then, like, for example, the linear activation function, those linear neurons, then you just won't get the answer. The opposite of underfitting is overfitting. It's what happens when your network fits that training data really, really well, but it doesn't generalize to unseen examples. Because what we want is a network that both describes the relationship and can generalize to new examples. So the cost function might be really low, but it's not performing very well on any tests. And there are a few reasons why this might happen. So, for example, if you use all of your training data to train the network, you don't have anything left to test it on. So one thing you can do is hold back some data, like 20% of it, for example, for validation, and we're going to call that the cross-validation set. You hold back another 20% to test. Then you train on the 60% training data. You try different configurations with the cross-validation set. And by configurations, I mean like try different learning rates, different number of hidden units and hidden layers. And then you do your final test once you've got a good configuration on the test set. And you see how well the network does on that, and that is how you judge your network. Another way around is to get more data. There are a few techniques using different neural networks configured in different ways and averaging across them, like bagging, but I won't go into that now. Or there's something called regularization. So imagine we've got this house price problem, and we're feeding into a network lots of different properties of the house, like the number of bedrooms, the size in square feet. And we've got some properties like whether or not the previous owner is leaving behind the carpets. And they might just be noise because they don't really contribute to the price of the house. So they're extra features that you don't really need. But maybe say, we don't know in advance what those features will be. Regularization is a way to shrink down these values that don't really contribute. So play on TensorFlow and look at L1 and L2 regularization, but I won't go into them now. Nice thing about neural networks is that when you have a big neural network and it's working together well, you can get groups of units, of hidden units and hidden layers that work together to form feature detectors. And this is particularly apparent if you look at convolutional neural networks or anything like that. So here, for example, our network has learned through lots of examples of birds that a beak makes a bird, the body makes the bird, and the eye makes the bird. And that's just a gross simplification of lots of neurons working together to form these feature groups. So when you feed an example through, it can go, yep, it's got those features that I think makes a bird. And then if you feed something through like a jug with a spout that looks suspiciously like a beak, it might identify the beak as being part of a bird, but it doesn't have the other properties, so it won't recognize it. Take a look at convolutional neural networks, and I'll just put an example in here. Go to this website and have a play, and that might become obvious to you. If not, it's fun to play with. So in terms of limitations, I've mentioned a few times that this is like a complicated function machine. We've got lots of different functions in the different neurons all working together to try and map these inputs to outputs, to try and make predictions. So the limitations are everything that you'd expect with that. So for example, we might build a network that recognizes pictures of cats and dogs, but you can't take that trained network out of that context and put it in a new one and expect it to take over the world. If you want to learn more about neural networks, then please check out my blog post or direct message me on Twitter. But a really good place to start is this Stanford Online course on Coursera by Andrew Ng. Otherwise, if you're more confident with your maths, and this is all quite simple for you, do the Geoffrey Hinton course from the University of Toronto, which I highly recommend. Thank you very much.